So, Prince is suddenly dead. I'm going to say it again. So Prince is suddenly dead. And as the death of people who we believe are not supposed to die has a tendency to do, it always has a way of bringing our own mortality into sharper focus. Retrospective exhibitions also have a way of marking passages and transitions of one kind or another. And so, and looking back at where you were and how you got to where you are, I mean, sometimes has the effect of producing a sense of melancholy. Because there's always a sadness that accompanies remembrance, especially when it's remembrance of times when you were much younger, perhaps more vital, and seem to have your whole future ahead of you. And so, like everybody else, I was a young man once. And this is a photograph that was taken at an exhibition in LA just I can say on the eve of my departure from Los Angeles, going to New York, where I had a residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And that transition from myself at about 28 or 29 in Los Angeles, going to New York, set in motion all of the events and all of the activities that made it possible for me to get to this place I am today. So I spent almost 3 years in New York. I met the woman who was the love of my life, who brought me to Chicago. Her name was Cheryl Lynn Bruce. She was working as a PR representative at the Studio Museum when I got there. And oddly enough, was the very first person I met when I got to town. And so, actually, this is a little out of order. And since we're looking back, there are a lot of things that you reflect on when you're looking back. And one of the things you reflect on is how little things sometimes seem to change. So here's a collage I made in 1978. And the title of that collage was, "They Have Come to Save Us, and Now They Carry Out Aggressions Against Us." And so these kinds of reflections on the past and then on the present, where I'm sort of revisiting that same idea, but in a much more subtle and maybe more complex way, where I'm more interested now not only in my own reflection, but in the reflection of another subject. And so this is actually a very recent painting, just finished in November of last year, which has miraculously, since Dita was talking about miracles, so it's miraculously found its way into the Museum of Modern Art, where it now hangs. But the journey from there, from where I was in that photograph to the collage that I showed you to this particular painting, we're going to reminisce about a little bit through the slides that I'm going to show and some of the other images and some of the stories I might tell. So when I got to Chicago in December of 1987, Cheryl and I had not yet married because we were going to do that thing where you didn't live together until after you were married. So I was in Chicago. I took up residence at the YMCA on 50th and Indiana. because of course when I came to Chicago in 1987, I had 2 nickels hardly to rub together. And one of the things I found out when I was in New York is that, you know, when you really have a hard time finding an apartment, and in New York it's hard to find an apartment, but when you have a hard time finding an apartment, the fallback place is always, the always ready fallback place was the YMCA. So when I was in New York, after I'd sort of run out my lease on the sublet I had, I ended up living at the YMCA on 135th Street. In Harlem, and that YMCA is famous for a lot of reasons, one of which is that Malcolm X was also a resident at that Y at one time, and in the barbershop of that YMCA, there's a great mural by Aaron Douglas. So when I came to Chicago, having gone through some of those transitions and then arriving and finding a place to live, so this room at the Y on 50th in Indiana was not only my living space, but my live-work space. This was my studio and home. And that room was only 6 feet by 9 feet. But the fact that I saw the possibility and felt the necessity to continue working no matter what kind of space I was in, or whatever the circumstances I was operating under at the time, this says something about the kind of determination I think it takes in order to reach the place that I think I am right now. So my motto had always been, always keep moving. Always keep moving. There's no circumstance under which your ambition and your desire should be curtailed because of social circumstances, political circumstances, or economic circumstances. And so my thing was, you always find a way. And the only way you can success is perseverance, more than anything else. And what perseverance allows you to do is to continue working, because you cannot make progress and you cannot develop unless you're working continuously. And so I always tried to find a way to keep going, to keep doing things, no matter where I was and no matter what my circumstances were. And so that room I stayed in for almost 3 years before we were married. And the transition on some level that allowed me to go from there to another place was that I was already promised the position of production designer on Daughters of the Dust, a film that was made by Julie Dash. And so in 1989, they finally put together the financing to go down to South Carolina to shoot that film. And I was the production designer, was down on St. Helena Island in South Carolina for 14 weeks, collecting material, building sets, and all that stuff. And the money that I made on Daughters of the Dust bought me a complete year of not having to have a job once I came back to Chicago. And using that money and making that work that I did in that year, that was the money I used to get to apply for a National Endowment for the Arts grant. Now, I was doing all that work in the apartment that Cheryl and I were going to share together. Of course, I moved into it first because she was still staying at her mother's house, but when she arrived, that apartment looked just like that. Like that YMCA room. The first thing she said, well, where am I supposed to be? This looks like a studio. But the thing was that it's what the ability to keep working and where I thought I could go if I kept working would get us seemed important enough to make that kind of sacrifice. And she made that sacrifice. So I got a lot of images I'm going to show, and I'm going to try to do most of it without a lot of commentary. And so we're going to pick up. So the whole process is going to be a backwards kind of. We're going to be going back in time. And so if you know, in the exhibition upstairs, the show ends with a series of abstract-looking works. And I say abstract-looking because they are not truly abstract works. So those ink blot works and the large color field painting, all of which on some level are supposed to be absent imagery, and with the absence of imagery, they're supposed to allow for a kind of transcendental experience, either in the color field of a painting that's like the Barnett Newman painting, or to be lost in the kind of play of shapes and colors and textures and things in a totally abstract-looking picture. This is one of the paintings that's in that room. This is another that's not there, as well as this one, which is also not there. Now, when I say not really abstract, I say that in part because these works are, the ink blot itself is not an abstraction, it's an object, it's an image, it's a figure. And it's a figure that we understand and that we know something about the function of. We know what ink blots are used for, and we know what they're supposed to look like, because we know something about how they come to be as a phenomena. Now, the difference between the way I approach these as blot images as opposed to as blots as phenomena is that all of my blots are completely constructed, and these blots are constructed in exactly the same way I use in composing any kind of other figurative painting. Because the figure itself is just simply a collection of shapes and lines and colors and textures as well. And so I'm thinking through these pictures and building into them a kind of relative symmetry that's not the absolute symmetry that we expect when we think about the ink blot as a phenomena produced by folding a piece of paper in half. So I'm going to go through, and so you'll see some of these things are here, but a lot of things that are in the slides are things that are not here, and they say something about the way in which retrospective shows operate. I mean, in a way, so the retrospective show it never shows you everything because it can't. And so it leaves a lot of gaps and a lot of holes in the in a particular grouping or a body of work. And so one of the things you'll get a fuller sense of from the images I show now is how broad some of those groupings of work actually are. And now, if you had unlimited space and unlimited money to do shipping and things like that, then you could put together a proper retrospective that maybe has like 1,500 objects in it. But given the limitations we have to operate under, I'm supplementing with the slides. So these are works that you see there. And these are among the more recent works that I've done. And there's something that's, for me, that's really important about the ways in which the works go backwards and forwards between, or flip back and forth between abstraction and representation. In part because I had always, there have been periods in which artists, and often in particular African-American artists, have avoided figuration because the black figure in particular exists as a kind of limitation that doesn't allow a spectator who is not black sometimes to get past the fact of its blackness and then see the work in the fullness of its aesthetic complexity. And so in order to be seen often as a genuine mainstream artist, a lot of artists abandoned the figure and went for abstraction because there's no evidence in an abstract object, there's no evidence or even suggestion that the culture or class or race of the person who made it might have something to do with the fact that they made the thing in the first place. And so that was supposed to produce a kind of freedom in the absence of the figure. But my feeling had always been, and the reason on some level the exhibition is titled Mastry the way it is that all things should be in play at all times for everybody. That there's no requirement to jettison the figure for abstraction in order to be seen as either aesthetic or complex. That one has to do is to figure out how to make that image function pictorially too. That it's not just about the reproduction of the likeness of an image, but it's the way in which the image within a picture operates to help enhance and make more complicated the image, the painting as an object. And so I'm trying to demonstrate to the degree that I can that it's the idea that's represented by the picture as an object itself that's more important than anything else. And so one of the reasons why the figures in my paintings are as black as they are is that becomes a given. That once you see the picture and you identify that figure as black as it is, then that's something you don't have to talk about anymore. It just is. It becomes a fact of its existence. And then you can start thinking about it in relationship to everything else that's happening within the picture space. So, I'll go through a few other things. As we go back in time. Oops. So how'd that get in there? So now, from that array of images I showed just a little while ago, a certain kind of sensibility, I think, can be determined. And one is that in no instance in which those pictures, in the pictures you saw, was there anything sensational about the picture beyond, if you want to argue, the fact of the blackness of the figures in it. In every one of those images, the circumstance under which the figure is operating in the picture presents a kind of normality, a kind of normalcy, even a kind of mundane kind of aspect of the existence of the figure in its space. And in some ways, it's that normality, that lack of sensationalism, the ordinariness of the image, even in its extraordinariness, that's really at the heart of what I'm trying to do. Because a part of the goal is to make the presence of that figure in its extreme a commonplace. So that is no longer out of the ordinary or the exception to the rule that when you encounter pictures in museums, that you won't encounter a picture like that. This is a part of the whole project I think I've been engaged in since the 1980s when I produced the painting that begins the show, a portrait of the artist as a shadow of his former self. Now this painting is based in part on, so you see that crown that figure wears is the crown. This is Gloria Smith, who was the second Miss Black America from 1968, second Miss Black America pageant. And this was, so in the Miss Black America pageant, we know came into existence because they didn't allow black women in the Miss America pageant. And so as an alternative to being shut out completely and not have any sort of framework in which you can conceive the idea of blackness and beauty at the same time, an alternative pageant was created, and it was to be held on the same stage, on the same runways in Atlantic City that the Miss America pageant was supposed to be held on when it was first started. So anyway, one more in a group. I had an exhibition at the David Werner Gallery in London in October 2014, and the idea of that show with its title was, the title was Look See. And it really was about looking and seeing and about seeing oneself, presenting oneself to be seen, presenting oneself to be photographed, and also being looked in upon by someone who might be an intimate of the person, because the space that you, as a spectator, would be occupying is the space in which somebody who is familiar would be in. Now, this next image, I mean, it has value because it represents something. So this is the cover of the African art collection from the Menil collection. That object in the Menil collection, when I first saw that, I thought this is one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen, period. Leave it at that. And I'm going to show a couple of abstract paintings, only because, I mean, on the one hand, so who is that didn't turn their phone off when the man asked him to turn their phone off? So why do I show these? Because they say something about the way in which I structured my project and the whole project of representation in total. So if, on the one hand, the figures I developed are trying to speak to ideas of presence and ideas of absence, and that one of the things I am also engaged in is an examination of the art historical record as it relates to the presence and absence of a black figure representation in the kind of canonical pantheon of painting, and that I chose the image that I did because I thought that image would have the greatest impact on that canonical record, because the thing you are least likely to see when you go to the museum is a figure that's black. That's the least likely thing you're to see. And so if that's the case, and I want my work to have the maximum impact, then that would seem to be the most obvious approach to take. Now, in abstraction, what are the issues in abstraction? I mean, on some level, it's surface, it's color, it's texture, it's scale, it's shape, it's all those things. And you can do 1,000 of those. And if you put another one in the middle of that, it has no effect on what people expect to see when they come to see another group of things that are sort of like that. So since I'm trying to get the maximum impact, and what I'm really wanting to do is to change people's expectations of what they're likely to see when they go to the museum, figuration has the greatest potential to do that. Abstraction as another abstraction on top of another abstraction on top of another abstraction. And all of them don't give you much that's different from what a lot of other people who are doing abstraction are doing. And as a consequence, it kind of doesn't matter if you got 20 or if you got 10. It's going to give you a similar effect. I see people starting to... Somebody's going to ask about that later. Now I'm going deeper. I'm going to go a little deeper into the hole. So, I would wager that there's probably nobody in this audience who could tell me who those people are. Huh? So, well, these are 12 men who walked on the moon. And so, and that's quite an achievement. Not only did they walk on the moon, but if you look in the background, they got a car up there they took with them and they drove around. So that picture is there primarily because, I mean, in the history of space travel, we have somehow managed to organize our interests around achievements that are not 1/5 as significant as the ability to do that thing, to get to the moon, to take a car and to drive around on it and then come back home. And so there's something about the capacity to do that matters. In the same way that the reason why my show is called Mastry, there's something about the capacity to do all these things that matters. Not so much what you do. It's like, we don't know what they did while they were riding around. We do know they picked up some rocks and sent them back. They picked up a little dirt and brought it back. But that's not the achievement. The rocks and the dirt are not the achievement. The ability to get there is the achievement. And for me, the independent capacity to do that same kind of thing matters more than anything else. It's like if you never get a chance to work on something like that, then there are certain things you actually never get a chance to think about. And out of that, there are certain other kinds of outcomes that you can never produce because you never had to go through this sort of process. I mean, this reminds me of a critique of Richard Wright in Kabina Mercer's collection of essays, Welcome to the Jungle, in which he criticizes Wright for saying that he had arrived at philosophical conclusions and assumptions that it seemed to have taken academic philosophers a whole lot of energy and a whole lot of effort to do without having to read anything to get to it. Now, as Kabina Mercer said, this is dangerous thinking. I mean, the sort of notion that you kind of naturally arrive at things without having to put in any effort for it. Certainly not having to put any intellectual effort into it, not having to do any research, not having to do any calculations. That this is, as far as he's concerned, is dangerous. And it's especially dangerous for people who have been subjugated, enslaved, or otherwise colonized. So, this sort of takes me somewhere near the beginning with this picture, which is based in part on a reading of Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man. And what you will find out in my approach to making artworks is that challenge that I think Kabina Mercer was leveling, that you don't rely on sort of quote unquote natural ability or talent, that when you're engaged in a world as complex as the world we are engaged in, that you go at it self-consciously, analytically, and always intellectually. And so what this work means for me, and what it was the moment in which I figured out how to start using the idea of blackness as a rhetorical device, the black as a rhetorical figure, and as a linguistic figure within the context of a classical idea about what it takes to make a painting or what it takes to make a picture. And so what's important about that picture is that everything that I felt like I had learned from examining and analyzing and studying classical Renaissance painting, in particular classical Italian Florentine painting, I used that to make that picture, so that every element of the picture was placed precisely in its shape, in its direction, in its orientation to another thing that was happening in the picture. So it has all of that material and all that information in it, but doesn't look anything at all like a Raphael painting. And that was really important for me, that you could deploy the knowledge and the principles, but it didn't have to turn out looking like something that you had copied from somebody else. Anyway, so this painting is upstairs too, and so it's a kind of a visual pun. Since you already know the other painting is titled "Portrait of the Artist as a Shadow of His Former Self," then this is just the portrait of the artist in a vacuum. And it's the intonation using the ampersand as what is the audio kind of figure, but it's the sound that matters. And in sounds, artist in a vacuum and a vacuum, those two things sort of sound a lot alike. And so that's part of it's just a pun, a visual joke. Now I'm gonna go through a couple of things. So this a lot of the paintings I do, I mean, I think of almost everything I do in fairly instrumental terms. You know, after that moment when you saw me in that photograph earlier, where I was standing next to a drawing of mine that was just a kind of landscape with two tornadoes in it. Once I really understood what some of the mechanisms of art history was, my whole approach to everything changed, and I started treating everything strategically. And then everything was about a kind of idea, and about an idea of a relationship between a painting and its object and its subject, and the museum as an institution, and art history as a kind of institutional, as institutional legitimacy. And since, I mean, we know that the way art museums operate has a lot to do with accumulations of large quantities of excess capital. You just take a glance at those auction records that are being set by artworks now. You know, it's like they're not going down to the corner store buying some artworks that end up in museums. Not often. And since the black population in the United States has always been undercapitalized as a population, without access to the capacity to generate capital, and without levels of excess capital to spend on things like artworks, especially when it gets past a certain threshold. So the likelihood of artworks being bought by black collectors gets slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. The more well-known, the more famous, and the higher the prices of the artworks that are being made go. And so, in a way, there's a kind of irony in a picture like this that announces that it is black-owned. And the reality is this is not black-owned. The person that bought that painting is not a black person. And even if you encourage black people to buy black, you are thwarted. And so now you'll start seeing varieties of things too. So this is a piece that's kind of based on the Donald Judd sort of boxes called Ladder of Success. And it conflates a series of historical ideas that people might have come in contact with. I mean, there are lots of philosophies of success in terms of how what kind of character you should have, what kind of personality, all those kinds of things. And those things have been enumerated over the centuries. You can say Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People is a part of that sort of idea of how do you self-consciously put yourself in a position where you might be more successful than not. And so this is based on a chart that I'd pulled out of a history book that outlined these steps to success, which is punctuality, honesty, I can't remember all of them, persistence, prudence, all those things you step up. And then insert at the top of that the principles of Kwanzaa, the Kujichagulia, Umoja. It's like all of the principles of Kwanzaa that was supposed to, for black people, give a pathway to success as well. Now, that plus the painting that's upstairs, you can see this one up there. You see how they have a relationship to an art historical model, but they do something different than that model does. I mean, in both the case of the Donald Judd and the case of this Barnett Newman painting, the Barnett Newman painting being titled Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue. So I did a suite of paintings that sort of invert that in a way. It says, Who's Afraid of Red, Black, and Green? And rather than being just a pure color field painting that's supposed to generate this transcendental effect because you're so engulfed by the color itself and the expanse of the picture, that you're supposed to have a kind of disembodied experience. I always have to find a way to root the thing firmly in the reality of the world we live in. And so as I took apart the Barnett Newman painting, and this is exactly the same size as the Barnett Newman painting. It's 9 feet by 18 feet. Exactly the same size. I made 3 paintings, and each one of those paintings privileged one of those colors as one of the red, black, and green colors as the central color of the picture. And so this first one is a text painting, and you can read it when you get upstairs. It says, If They Come in the Morning, which is based on a book that Angela Davis put together of letters from political prisoners. And the phrase is a phrase she borrowed from an open letter that James Baldwin wrote to her when she was in jail. So it's the way in which these poetics and politics and the experience of a kind of transcendental space in the picture, all of these things, I'm trying to balance all those things and make all those things operative simultaneously. So this is, again, presence and absence. I'm never interested in total absence. I'm not interested in erasure. I'm interested in negotiations, and the negotiations are things that have to happen in the moment, in real time, with real people, against the backdrop of real events. And so it's the way in which the way you meditate on a thing is, to me, should always be informed by the moment in which you live and the history that got us here. So the second painting is a black field. In the slides, there are things you can't see. So the whole thing sort of functions as a triptych, basically. And then the green one, so the privilege is the green. And then history always has a place in our consciousness. And where there are no representations of figures who have a place in history, I tend to produce something that gives those figures a representation. So there are 4 paintings in this suite called the Stono Group. And if you know, the Stono Rebellion was one of the earliest slave rebellions in the United States in the 18th century, it was a little while before Nat Turner and everybody, and Denmark Vesey and everybody, but it took place in South Carolina, and it came close to being the most successful slave revolt, except for a fatal flaw. And the fatal flaw ultimately was a belief that they had a right to fight for their freedom like anybody else had a right to fight for their freedom. And so what they did as they were starting to amass more troops in the cause, they made some flags, they had some banners, they were beating drums and marching down the highway on their way to St. Augustine, Florida, because the Spanish had put out a notice that any slave who could escape to St. Augustine would get their freedom. Now, on their march from South Carolina down to St. Augustine, they took a break. And while they were having a party, really, it gave the forces and the authorities time to catch up, and there went the whole project. So the leader of that rebellion was a man named Cato, or Jimmy, so also known as Jimmy. And so I made a representation of these figures. And literally, I mean, they are sort of standing at the gallows at dawn. And from painting to painting to painting, you'll see the day starts to break as you go from one figure to the next figure. And so the light changes. You'll see them better upstairs. You can't see them so well at least I can't see them so well on the slides. But anyway, this is also the way in which I sort of use history as a point of meditation, not as an illustration of an event. In the same way that this figure, John Punch, who is a figure around which the permanent enslavement of black people in the United States was kind of implemented. Because we know that John Punch was an indentured servant in the 18th century. He, along with two white indentured servants, ran off from the man they were working for. When they were caught, the two white guys got 5 or 6 years added to their term of indenture, but John Punch was made a slave for the rest of his life. And then they started to construct the laws around which the black enslaved would always be permanently enslaved. And so there's no picture of John Punch, but there's reference to John Punch in the historical narrative. And so I thought we need to be able to put that idea in that moment with somebody, that he was a real person. In the same way that David Walker, people who know David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the United States, to the citizens of the United States of New York, and in particular the colored citizens of the United States. So David Walker, another sort of prototypical rebel, a free man who engaged in subversive activities in the hopes of inciting a slave insurrection that would ultimately result in the freedom of vast numbers of black people. And so the book he wrote, David Walker's Appeal, is fundamentally a critique of the Declaration of Independence and the hypocrisy he sort of outlines as it relates to the condition of black people. And then there's, of course, the famous Nat Turner, who everybody knows about. And I mean, and it's interesting. So the controversy around Nat Turner has everything to do with the levels of violence that were enacted during the slave rebellion. And it's a way in which these kind of narratives of heroism are often denied to the black population that had been enslaved, when you can sort of go through the sort of mythic narratives of liberation elsewhere in history and in the Bible, where, I mean, a certain amount of violence seems necessary to the liberation of a people. So anyway, that's Nat Turner with the head of his master. And then I'll show a few things because I don't want to get too far along because it's 3 o'clock already. My goodness. So anyway, some pictures that are not in the show. Great America. colorblind test. I did a group of paintings based on the red-green colorblind test, the Rhythm Master Comic Project. This is the first iteration of the Rhythm Master Comic Project in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie International. There's some comic images, the Pantheon of Characters. You'll see that image as a part of a thing up there. And the thing that's important, so the Rhythm Master sort of began in the corridors, in the African art corridors at the Art Institute of Chicago. I mean, that's where most of those things, most of them were set in the museum at first. But the narrative overall is set against the backdrop of the demolition of public housing projects when they started the plan for transformation in Chicago. And so this is actually a scene, they moved the African galleries finally got what you could call proper galleries when they did the renovation and added the new wing to the Art Institute. And so, but there was a period when they were just sort of moving it around. It was in the basement ones somewhere, and you walk in there, and then there'd be a sign saying it's not here any longer. You go down the hall, and there'd be something that said, "Coming soon," And so you could be wandering through the museum looking for the African art collection. It just wasn't on display. So I just did something about that. Anyway, it's a long story. Everything will be all right. I just know it will. And here, I mean, these are puppets. These are puppets that are based on the Rhythm Master Project. So I did a puppet show, puppet performance at the Wexner, and using Bunraku as a puppet form, a Japanese puppet form that was one of the most incredible things I had ever seen. And so I was so taken by that style of puppet performance where it's three puppeteers operating that one puppet that's about a third life size. You have the master who operates the head and the right hand. You have somebody who operates the left hand, then you have a puppeteer who operates just the feet. And all three of them are there together. You see everybody, except the two assistants are wearing a black hood so you can't see their face, while the master is fully exposed and in this regalia with this like silver and shimmering kind of outfit like a superhero. But anyway, so I did this puppet show that was based on the Rhythm Master. And so these are some of the puppets I made. And they're, again, those Rhythm Master characters for Bunraku. Prince. That's one of those up there. Collages. That painting you'll see in the show, Pin-Up. A big painting that's sort of like, there are two paintings up there, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, but this was a painting, that little piece of paper said, prettiest girl in the whole wide world. And the Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, nude in a spotlight. I got to move kind of quickly here. A flag with a pin-up. It's another pin-up image. That one you'll see upstairs, if you haven't already. Black Star. Scipio Moorhead. If we have a few minutes to say anything about it in Q&A, I will, but I don't think we have a whole lot of time now. And then there's a series of portraits of painters. There are, I think, 2 or 3 in the show. Yeah, there are 3 in the show, but not this one. That one's there. Not that one. Not that one. This was actually in a show at the Met now. But one of the things that I was doing with these, in particular, with these, is that this is also a way that within a single picture, you can have a conversation about abstraction and representation simultaneously, where the palette itself sort of functions as a mode of abstraction within a picture that's about representation, but is also about the way in which systems of representation operate and the way in which you can sort of contradict or go against the implied logic of the system. And so if you have a painter, a self-portrait by a painter, painting the self-portrait, but that self-portrait is rendered as a paint by number painting, except the way in which the color is being applied is arbitrary, then it talks about all of those things at one time. And so this is just sort of how I go about doing what I do. So that painting on the easel is this painting. But, of course, it doesn't correspond in any way at all with the figure that's outside the picture that's being painted. So it's the way in which all these things sort of work. That painting is upstairs. It's a painting in honor of Beryl Wright, who was the first black curator who worked here at the MCA. Vignette. And then there's a whole series of vignettes that take as their point of departure this sort of Rococo model of a kind of joy, pastoral romance, and all those things. So if you take the Fragonard painting, and then this is a suite of 5 paintings that are over there in the collection at the Art Institute now. And so in this group of paintings, it's an animation. So there are 5 panels, and you see the 360 rotation of that figure, where each one of those is different. And then various other, I'm going to keep going. Collage again. And then also, I mean, it's paintings that are sort of about being paintings that are commodified and available for purchase. Red Hot Deal. Low price. And then upstairs, you'll see that the black painting up there, on sale Black Friday. It's up there. And then now as sculpture, so those coins on the floor are what you would call a dispersal piece as sculpture. The title of it is the 99-cent piece, and it's 99 cents in change. 3/4 a dime, 2 nickels, and 4 pennies. Gilded, and those quarters are 5 feet in diameter. And the whole project is rendered with the detail, the maximum amount of detail you would see if you had that quarter as a brand new quarter. And so, but a part of that whole show, that whole exhibition had a lot to do with the way in which we understand the value of things and the arbitrary relationship between the image that's represented and the object as it's to be purchased. And so the 99-cent piece, the alternate title of it is it's the 99-cent piece, AKA $136,000 in change. Because it costs $136,000 to make it. And so that says something about, so that $136,000 is a barrier that a lot of people who want to make some stuff can't cross to get those things made. And since if you, for people who know Cecil Taylor, the jazz musician, there's a great documentary film on Cecil Taylor called Imagine the Sound. You should check it out. And in there, he he's interviewed by somebody in there who asks him if he's bitter because other people who were cashing in on innovations that he had developed while he seemed to be overlooked as far as the money was concerned. And his reply was a reply that I think is worth taking to heart. And so Cecil Taylor says, well, you know what? No, I'm not bitter because nobody asked me to do this. Nobody asked me to do this. And one of the things about making artworks, one of the things you're trying to achieve is a certain level of freedom and liberation to do what you want, independent of anybody else's interest in that thing. So I made this thing because I just wanted to see what it looked like. But what made it possible for me to do that thing and not have to ask anybody's permission to do it was that all of the work that I'd done from the time I left that room at the Y up to this moment put me in a position where I had the kind of capital that would allow me to take the kind of risk to do something that nobody asked me to do. To me, that's complete freedom. The freedom to do whatever you want without having to ask permission and without fear of the consequences. So if nobody buys that, it doesn't really matter. But what I learned or what I saw from having done it is hugely important for me. So anyway, those little draw me things you see in the magazines sometimes. And I had, so my nephews, I let them go at it on the picture one day. They all wanted to do it. And my wife Cheryl did one too. So everybody had a chance. So anyway, let me go through a couple of things, and then I'll be finished. An installation that was at Monique Meloche. That painting you'll see upstairs. This one you'll see upstairs. More of the vignettes, but instead of black and white vignettes, these are vignettes that were in color. That one you'll see upstairs. This one you won't. Neither that one, but you'll see that one. You'll see this. You won't see this. So, and this is there, this is not. The Lost Boys, the Style, the Beauty Shop, the Scouts, and the Scoutmaster and Den Mother, which aren't there. The Garden Project paintings, Bang, Our Town. A big woodcut I did that's about 48 feet long. And then that suite of mementos paintings, all of which were based on the living rooms of people I know. So this is my wife's great aunt's house down on 127th and Wallace. She's no longer living, so I can give out the address. She's no longer there. My mother-in-law's best friend, who just passed away last year. She used to live in Hyde Park. This one that's upstairs, that's my mother's living room in L.A. And then there was a series of smaller paintings that went with it. And then another kind of a souvenir, because that show I did for the Renaissance Society, in which those mementos paintings was in, was about commemoration, about how we commemorate a moment in time, how we commemorate the 1960s as a decade. And this is a commemorative vase with artificial flowers, a cluster of things called As Seen on TV. And it's based on, that cross is the cross that's on 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And then little sort of fetish-like objects where I took the continent of Africa, cut it up, and reassembled it as a cubist sculpture, and then add things to it. You'll see heirlooms and accessories upstairs, some photographs, not that one you won't see, but black painting and this black photograph. And this Black Christmas. And they are called that because these are photographs that were taken under black light. So again, it's this presence and absence as a kind of phenomena in which the condition of the light that you use determines the condition of the quality of the photograph, because that's what all photographs are, is a kind of registration of the way in which light reflects from an object and can be captured on a piece of film. Same thing, that's my wife, Cheryl, as a kind of odalisque. And then the last photograph is called Black. And it's the photograph of the Johnson's Publishing Building, taken at night from Lakeshore Drive. And so you have ebony and jet, which are two of the darkest degrees of blackness. And so I'm going to stop here as far as showing images are concerned, and say, I mean, really, so looking back over all these things I've done, and the impact they have had on my life, and maybe the encouragement they've given to other people who want to make images, and the way in which I've managed to find a place in a lot of the major museums in the country, is in a lot of ways more than I ever expected to achieve. Because all along the way, there was always this other part of my, at the same time that I had this fairly extreme sense of self-confidence, there were always doubts. There were always doubts. And these doubts come from the fact that most museums, most institutions, they have done quite well without the presence of black people for hundreds of years. The people who go to work in them don't arrive at the office saying, well, where am I going to find some black people today? And because none of these works I'm making are done by commission, that I'm doing them as a kind of speculation, it's always a 50-50 chance that you will find an audience who's not asking for that, interested in that. And so I persevered against what I thought were overwhelmingly chancy odds. And on some level, I think I lucked out. And I find myself standing here at the MCA for a second time with an exhibition upstairs. So. All right, thank you. Well, now, if there are any questions, you can ask a couple, and then Dita will take you upstairs, and you can see the show if you haven't seen it.
And
yes.
we have microphones. We'll do about 10 minutes of Q&A. My colleague Ann and I have microphones, so if you can raise your hand, we will run up so that everyone can hear the questions.
Yeah. My name is Khalil Robert Irving, and I'm a Chancellor's Graduate Fellow at Washington University in St. Louis. Traveled here overnight to see this lecture and see this exhibition.
Thanks
I want to
for
say
coming.
thank you. Your work and your word has an amazing impact on my life and what I do in my studio. But I have a couple questions. One starting, we're looking back and you're sharing your work and your life and your trajectory. And I was wondering if you could talk about your work looking towards the future, looking forward, maybe starting from the policeman image.
Mm-hmm.
And my second question is, knowing all that you do now, what are you willing to share with young artists, young black artists working today to help them persevere and challenge the narrative for the future?
Oh, so the first part, looking forward from the policeman. Well, so here's the thing. I mean, there are more things that I want to do than I'm going to have time to get to. That I know. And so for me, I mean, since I said earlier that everything I do, I think of in instrumental terms, in terms of what kind of work that thing can do in the world. And since I'm always, we are always confronted by areas of absence in which the kind of full participation of all the people that you can encounter in the world is not, you can't take it for granted. In the realm of comics, so the reason I started the Rhythm Master Project in the first place is that there are really very few black superhero narratives, in particular black superhero narratives created by black comic book creators that can claim the kind of authority that the Marvel and DC pantheon of superhero characters can claim. So everybody knows Superman, everybody knows Batman. Now, because you watch TV, everybody knows The Flash. And when the next round of movies after the Superman v. Batman comes out, you're going to know Wonder Woman and Aquaman and all those figures. And then you're going to get your the remaining characters from the Marvel bullpen coming to life. So we all know the Hulk and all that stuff. And so to the degree that for a black kid looking at comic books, they don't have any model that demonstrates that another black person can create a character that would be as compelling as those. That was one of the reasons why I started doing the Rhythm Master Project in the first place. And so the goal for that project is that once the narrative is sort of organized, it can be rendered as a graphic novel, and then from the graphic novel, it needs to be an animated feature film. And an animated feature film that has the same scope that we attribute to the Star Wars saga. I mean, it's like you got to be imagining things at the top end of the spectrum. And it's got to be something that you can, the way sequels to Spider-Man are built, the way sequels to Batman and sequels to Superman, the way sequels to all these movies, you got to create a structure or a platform on which you can build sequel after sequel after sequel. And it's the only way you can sort of generate a narrative effect that will linger in the culture in the way these do, and that can have the same kind of not only longevity, but the ability to operate across the globe. So America, it's like most of the money that American action movies make are made overseas. And that's because those stories of heroism are easily transported. But my thing is that everybody, so there has to be a more dynamic mix. Everybody's got to be in the game. I mean, and that will require understanding something about the way in which blockbusters like that get made and what the secret to the longevity of things like Marvel Comics, Spider-Man, you got to know something about what makes those work. And so my advice to young people is on the one hand, to be hyper ambitious. to be hyper ambitious, and to construct an artistic practice that you are confident that you are driving, that you're not sitting around waiting for somebody else to recognize that you have some kind of greatness or something worthwhile in it, that you're constantly trying to build it and project it. I mean, that you should be projecting it, you're not waiting for somebody else to figure out. And so if you take the whole, and the thing is, like, and you never stop working. You should be working every day. You know, I have a friend, so Arthur Jaffa is a friend of mine who was the cinematographer on Daughters of the Dust. And when I first met him, was in the era when people were still shooting a lot of Super 8 film. And he told me in the beginning when we first met, he said, you know what, so in order to really become sensitive to the way in which the film captures an image, that you have to expose film every day. And so I carried a Super 8 camera in my pocket every day with me, and every chance I got, I was exposing some film and processing it, and then looking at it. And then as you do that more, and I said, there's a friend of mine, Dawood Bey, sitting out in the audience, is a photographer. That man never, he is never without a camera. Never without a camera. Yet you are always shooting. Because always shooting, that means you are accumulating information that will inform things you don't know you want to do yet. So always be shooting, always be drawing, always be painting. That's, I mean, and then you have to want something, and then name it. Name the thing that you want. Because if you don't name it, you can't go after it. So you got to name it. So anyway, that's mine.